Hello, everybody. My name is Stan Fitterman. I'm honored to be joined today with the always delightful, always lovely Doug Carlson from TDA. I am the president of SFF Consulting Group, and we're HUD TA, work with a lot of HUD TA providers, have a lot of experience in housing and housing using CDBG-CV and other federal funds. Doug, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Stan. Good morning, everybody. I am Doug Carlson. I'm a senior consultant with TDA Consulting. My background is many years working with HUD and working with local governments on CDBG program administration and other HUD program administration. And really glad to be here to talk about housing activities.
All right. So a couple of housekeeping things y'all probably saw, those of you that were at the first session. The PowerPoint and the webinar recording will be available on the HUD Exchange. All the participants in listen-only mode, because there's a lot of you. Closed caption can be viewed using the show captions feature below the video player on your screen. If you need more information, there's an attendee guide available on the resources page of the event website. For questions, we'd like to ask you to use Slido, the Q&A feature that's located below the video player. Doug and I will be monitoring those questions, so we'll have a much easier time doing that than if you use the chat. So please don't use the chat. Only use the chat if you're doing having technical issues. And submit questions throughout the presentation. No need to hold them through the end. We may answer them when we get to an appropriate spot, especially if we know we're going to cover something in the future that's been asked about. But please feel free to start typing questions whenever they hit you, whenever the mood strikes you. Technical requests, as we said, we'd like you to use the chat box on the right of the screen. You can also email eventsupport@sitemgroup.com. But the chat box is really the way to go on that. To keep it interesting, we're going to be doing some polls. So you'll answer the poll questions using the poll tab that's located below the video player. And you may need to scroll down a little bit to view the poll questions. So you can download the Slido app. I did that. I've got it on my iPad sitting here. So when you see me glancing to the left, I'm not checking up on my Netflix queue or catching up on anything I've missed. I'm actually looking to see if there are any questions, but it was easy to download the app. And there's a code that is at the bottom of your screen that you put in, and you'll be able to see any question, the polls and the questions on another device, if that's how you'd like to handle it. Otherwise, you can just scroll down to see the questions and the polls. All right, and now we're time to get started. I'm going to turn it over to Doug because he's going to tell us about homeowner rehab and how it's used primarily, how CDBG grantees typically use it. Doug, take it away.
Thank you, Stan. Good morning again, everybody. Let's talk about rehabilitation with CDBG funds. This is, we're going to talk about several areas for housing activities, but rehab, we're going to cover both homeowner and non-homeowner types of rehabilitation. This is one of the areas of CDBG, probably along with public services, where the majority of the money is being spent. Public services are capped, of course, if it's not CV funds or 2019 or 2020 funds used for CV related activities, those are typically capped. But this activity is not, and these activities like housing activities and others are not. So it's often a form of CDBG assistance, and it can take many, many forms. So we're going to go over what some of those ways of doing housing and other real property activities can be done with CDBG. A couple of things to note. The majority of this information, if you don't have the Basically CDBG guide, this is in chapter 4 of the Basically CDBG guide, and then much of the content that we're going to go over is summarized again in many different ways in CPD Notice 0708, and that's going to be posted so that you can access that at a later date if you don't have access to that. That's the notice that talks about how you use CDBG funds to support housing activities. It's getting a little old, but it's still very relevant, and it's still used as one of the guides for how you do housing activities with CDBG. So if we talk about using CDBG for homeowner rehabilitation, there are many options that are available to grantees when it comes to doing homeowner rehabilitation. You can do weatherization, you can do emergency repair type activities, you can do other types of home improvements, you can do accessibility. There are any number of things that you can do to assist low and moderate income homeowners. And there's also more than one way for you to provide that assistance. If you're doing a homeowner rehabilitation program, you can be very straightforward and just provide a grant to the homeowner so that they can use those resources to hire contractors to do the work. You can also provide some form of a loan. So an example of that would be a very, very low interest loan for rehabilitation that is repaid over time, or the payments on which are deferred by the grantee, by the CDBG grantee to the homeowner until they sell the home or something else happens with the disposition of the property. You can also use it, although this is a little bit rare, to guarantee loans that are other forms of loans for assistance for rehabilitation. And then you can also use this to subsidize interest rates and principal write-downs and other types of mortgage financing. So, and other financing. So let's talk about the types of rehabilitation that you can do as well. There's different forms. You can do minor rehabilitation where you're just keeping a property up to code, or you're doing just very minimal improvements. You can do moderate rehabilitation, which does a lot more, say HVAC systems, roofs, insulation, siding, that type of rehabilitation program. And then you can do substantial rehabilitation and even reconstruction, which we'll talk about here in a second. So they have a wide range of types of activities that you can do that qualify as homeowner rehabilitation. If you also manage a home program, there is always a little bit of a misunderstanding about this with respect to CDBG. But with CDBG, if you're doing rehabilitation, you can decide if you're bringing items up to local code, which most folks are, frankly. People, many jurisdictions have their own building codes and standards. So almost all rehabilitation activity has to at minimum meet building codes and standards. However, if you wanted to use a higher standard like UPCS, which is what is used in home, which is the Uniform Physical Condition Standards, or other types of standards, you may do that. You also have the option to not use certain standards in your program. So you can decide whether you have certain property and housing standards for your program. And sometimes if you're managing both CDBG and home, it's really easy for grantees to kind of adopt the similar standards for the different programs, but that's not required with CDBG. And remember that you can always enhance the livability of a unit, whether it's accessibility improvements, whether it's weatherization, whether it's other types of things that try to improve the energy efficiency of a home and the livability of the home for the family. You can do those under this type of rehabilitation. So next slide, please, Stan. So what can you pay for? That's always the big question. If we're using CDBG for homeowner rehab, what is it that we can pay for? Well, there's a number of things that you can pay for. You can pay for the cost of labor and materials to do the rehabilitation on a homeowner's property. So that includes warranty premiums, hazard insurance premiums, flood insurance, those types of costs. And we will have a more robust discussion about lead-based paint abatement and removal and treatment. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's obviously an eligible cost for homeowner rehab and should be if lead paint is found during an inspection. There's also the purchase of equipment, but that's typically not done because you can't just purchase construction equipment. However, you could have a tool program if you're doing a sweat equity program and you have a lending bank of some kind and you want to let people borrow tools and then return them to the lending bank. You can do that under a sweat equity type approach where folks are doing some of their own work on their housing units. But that's pretty unusual. That isn't used very often. Whatever you're doing with respect to homeowner rehab, it's important to meet the cost standards at 2 CFR 200 with respect to cost allowability, with respect to procurement, and other standards related to how you manage and administer and have financial management of federal funds. So those standards need to be met when it comes to actually bidding out work or doing other types of things and determining cost reasonableness when you're doing homeowner rehabilitation. So those standards apply regardless of what type of activity you're doing. Next slide, please, Stan. So here's our first poll question, and I have to make sure that I have Slido up. And I do, thank you very much. So first poll question number 1. True or false? All CDBG funded rehabilitation assistance must be in the form of a direct pay loan. True or false? So I did my answer. I sent it in.
Got about a handful of folks so far, so we'll give them another minute. The number's increasing rapidly.
I'm liking the results so far. Looks like people are still responding, Stan. We've got about 68 responses, 70 responses on mine. Actually, more than that. Okay, it looks like we may have gotten there with all the responses. Oh, Stan, you're on mute. Stan, you need to, I think Stan needs to reshare his screen. Just 1 second. Let me go over the poll results while Stan's doing that. So we had 83 respondents so far on the poll, and the answer is, the majority of the answers that came in on the poll are that is a false question, and that is the actual correct answer. CDBG assistance for homeowner rehab does not necessarily have to be a direct pay loan. It can be there can be other forms of assistance that I spoke about earlier. They could be grants. They could be interest write-downs. They could be principal reductions. There are many. They could be deferred payment loans. There are many different ways that you can finance CDBG rehabilitation assistance. So it does not have to be in the form of a direct pay loan. So the correct answer to that question is false. Stan, do we have you back? Thank you for bringing your screen back up.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay.
And I'll just add that with one of the challenges of direct pay loans is that we usually have folks that we're serving are very low income. So they're below 50% of median. So usually they don't have room to make any kind of direct pay loan in their budget. In addition, from the local grantee side, if you have direct pay loan, you've got to service them. So someone's got to collect payments. Someone's got to make sure the payments are allocated to the client, and someone's got to figure out, you got to have policy in place, what you're going to do if someone stops paying. I mean, would you foreclose? Would you do forbearance? Would you? So direct pay loans with this type of activity can be tough to implement.
They can, and that is why things like deferred payment loans or other types of options are usually what are used for these types of programs. And then when due upon sale, for example, is much easier to not only manage in terms of the family's expenses, but to service as well, as Stan said. So let's go into a little bit more about rehabilitation and talk a little bit about reconstruction. Reconstruction is also not typically used a lot when it comes to rehabilitation for homeowner properties, but it can be used for that. It is eligible as its own rehabilitation activity in the regulations. And reconstruction of a unit can be on the same lot, but the structure doesn't have to be standing at the time of project commitment. So it can be a dilapidated unit that needs to be reconstructed. You cannot reconstruct and put more units on a site than you had, and that's in the CPD notice 0708. You can decrease the number of units under reconstruction, however, but you may have to do one-for-one replacement if you're taking low and moderate income housing units out of the housing stock. So reconstruction can get a little tricky if you're doing it. So this is, again, very rarely used, but it is possible to do it. You can also do manufactured housing if that is part of the community's permanent housing stock. And permanent housing stock is typically defined as something with a foundation and connection to utilities. So manufactured housing is often considered something like just sitting on a lot of some kind, but usually permanent housing stock is one that is on a foundation or connected to utilities. But again, reconstruction is very rarely used in manufactured housing. It's usually the replacement of a unit, but it could be rehabilitation to bring the unit back up to standards as well. So next slide, Stan. Did Stan freeze on us?
It seems that he may have.
I think I did. I can bring up the PowerPoint and go to that slide. 1 second.
Okay, thank you.
So again, we ask our attendees to please stand by. I need to open up the deck. 1 second.
Stan lives in Florida. I don't know what the weather's like there, but lightning storms and other types of weather always affect connectivity with the folks I work with in the South and the Southeast. I hope that's not it.
So which slide were you on, Doug?
I was on the one that says reconstruction. Stefan and I would have to pull up the deck myself to tell you which number it is, but I believe it's slide 10.
Okay, yes, I have it. 1 second, please. Again, thank you, attendees, for your patience while we get this resolved. And I am about to share now.
Okay.
1 second.
And I can just go into Stan's part of the presentation. I'll give him a, oh, wait a second. It looks like he might be coming back. So there he is.
But if you want me to continue to share, I'll just share.
Okay. Stan.
Sorry about that, everybody. I am getting kicked off periodically.
No problem. We are on slide 12 on reconstruction. Did you, Stan, hopefully you were there while as I went through that portion of the slides.
Right.
And so so I don't know if you have any comments or need to, so the support team is doing this for us now, advancing the slides.
Great.
So
Thank you.
I think at this point, we can go to the next slide unless you have a comment on reconstruction from your experience.
No, I believe, Doug, I think I was hearing you mention it. It's hard. It's not often done. And oftentimes you have to work with your CPD rep to make sure if you're replacing like with like, and what abilities you have to go a little bit in terms of adding more units or a little bit different construction structure
exactly.
of the deal.
Exactly. Thank you. So let's go to the next slide, please. So with respect to CDBG-CV and CDBG-CV funds that could be used for homeowner rehabilitation, if you haven't or you don't have access to, you will want to look up the PPR Tieback guide using CDBG-CV funds to prepare, prevent, and respond to coronavirus. That guidance was issued last year in early spring, and it talks about how you can use CDBG-CV for rehabilitation activities. And one of those things that you can do is you can alleviate problems with living conditions within the unit that make people more sensitive, or in some way, whether they have poor health outcomes, or they're elderly folks, or other type, or they have some kind of immunocompromised situation. There are ways that you can do rehabilitation and reconstruction of privately owned single-family housing if you're addressing conditions that make it hard for folks to live there in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. And remember that when we talk about the coronavirus pandemic and CDBG-CV, we are talking about prepare, prevent, and respond. So it's not only responding to the current coronavirus pandemic, but also using CDBG-CV funds to prepare for the next event of a pandemic that is related to coronavirus, and to be able to respond in some way. So it's not, or to prevent in some way, I'm sorry. So it's more than just a direct response like you would with a disaster recovery type program. You can also think about how you can be forward looking and also be able to think about how you prepare for another event. And rehabilitation of housing is one of those ways that you can use your CDBG funds for what we call PPR. So keep that in mind. Let's go to the next.
Well, Doug, while we're switching to the next slide, I have a couple of questions on rehab. One is, can the loans be completely forgiven over a period of time?
Yes, they can be forgiven over a period of time. Yes.
And usually are. Yeah. Yeah, usually they are, and often they are tied to basically what folks want to avoid is someone getting a lot of instant equity in their house they can cash out of. So you take a house that's in pretty rough shape, you rehab it completely. If you don't have some kind of loan or deferred loan or recapture agreement, they could sell it as soon as you finish and cash out with that increased value you gave them by repairing their home. So that's often how people will handle that with the deferred loan agreement. But eventually, remembering that repairs eventually will need to be done again. So often those length of time are 5 or 10 years, kind of tied to the expected life of the useful of the repairs.
Right. And I think one of the ways that just quickly that grantees can kind of account for this, Stan, is if you have policies and procedures that kind of dictate what the terms of your financing is, how you're providing it, whether or not it's a deferred payment loan or forgiven loan over a period of time, how you manage those policies for your program can help set the standard for homeowners so they kind of know if they're signing an agreement with you of some kind, that this is what they're kind of expected to do. For example, they can't just sell the house after all the improvements are done, for example, without having to repay the loan to you. But in many cases, it is forgiven over a period of time, not in all cases. Some grantees use this as a form of program income. I mean, over the years when interest rates were much, much higher, a 3% rehab loan was a really good deal. And for many grantees, it has generated substantial amounts of program income over the last 20, 30 years. So there's different ways to approach this, but there are going to be situations where people are in financial difficulties and you're going to have to reconsider your form of financing. And then the second question, do you want me to ask that or do you want to ask that?
The second one's about reconstruction. Yeah.
Right. So the second question asked, does it mean block with block or does it mean similar square foot or number of units? So when you're reconstructing on a site, you can actually add to that structure. You can actually add to the structure in one way or another when you're doing reconstruction. So, but when you're doing reconstruction, it is typically on that site. It is not reconstructing somewhere else typically, but it all depends. It's something you'd want to work out with your HUD office, but typically almost always it is reconstruction on the same site, and more than likely would have to be reconstruction on the same site. But and this is in the CPD notice 0708, by the way. It does talk about what your options are for reconstruction. Remember, if you reduce the number of low and moderate income housing units, then you have a potential issue with one-for-one replacement of lost units if you're doing this type of an activity. So, but you can build a little bit bigger if that's the question on that site. And Stan, I don't know if you have a comment or not.
No, I think that's perfect. All right, so let's move on to rehab of multifamily rental housing.
I think we've got one more quick question, Stan.
Okay.
Just came in. And the question is there a document that outlines the minimum requirements of any all housing rehab programs? And unfortunately, the answer to that, I believe, is no.
Yeah, not really. I mean, the 570's got details and the CPD notice that Doug keeps referencing, but minimum, remember with CDBG, I'm not sure what you mean necessarily by minimum requirements, but there's no rehab minimum requirements with CDBG,
no.
Unlike home. Home's got them, CDBG doesn't. So there's not really any minimum requirements on rehab standards.
No, there
And
are
then-
examples out there, however. So grantees set different standards depending upon the type of program they want to manage and how they want to manage it. And a lot of grantees use the home standards as the fallback. For example, when it comes to some of these standards, they line them up with their home program. But like Stan said, you obviously probably have to at a minimum meet local code, but whether you have a higher standard of some kind or not is really up to you. There's quite a few examples out there. Even if you just Google that, you could probably find a lot of different communities that have their standards posted online, but there isn't anything written that says, here's all the different standards and here's how they apply in one way or another. But it's a good reason why policies and procedures are really helpful and important for your program.
Absolutely. All right, now are we ready for rental?
We are ready for you.
All
Oh,
right.
wait a second, we're not.
Or not?
With reconstruction, do you have to use the same material? No, you do not have to use the same material. You can do other new materials. You can update it to code. You can use party plank. You can use better systems. You can use all the kinds of things you need and probably should use if you're doing reconstruction, right? You don't want it rebuilt back to 1932 standards.
All right, so let's go on. We got a couple more questions coming in, but why don't we handle those at the next
Let's
break if that works for you?
going. Let's keep going.
Okay, so multifamily rental housing, rehabilitation. It can be combined with acquisition, so you can buy it and pay for the rehab cost. CDBG, as we keep talking about, CDBG does not require minimum rehab standards, but local governments can. So often you may not want to go into a building that needs 4 major systems repaired and just repair one of them from a rental deal standpoint, because the housing's still not in great shape. So often local governments, grantees who do the rental rehab will bring it up to a certain standard. Historic preservation costs are eligible. Historic preservation deals are hard. They usually take more time. You have to go through what's called a 106 review with your state housing preservation officer. That can take 30 to 45 days. You have to often go through an architectural review board who's going to look at what kind of windows you're going to put in to make sure you're redeveloping it or rehabbing it rather in a historic manner. So it can be more expensive and take more time. You have the option of when doing historic preservation, there are historic tax credits that can be used. So sometimes you can offset this extra time and extra cost with additional subsidy. Another eligible activity is conversion. We call it here, you may have heard it called adaptive reuse. We're going to talk about it in a little more detail later on this morning. But basically it's taking something like an old Sears warehouse, an old abandoned building. In California, they're doing a lot of work with taking roadside motels and turning them into non-congregate shelter for folks experiencing homelessness. And sometimes they're turning them into permanent supportive housing. But that's allowable, of taking a building that was one use and turning it into housing. And as we've discussed, just like with home owner occupied rehab, we can do reconstruction, same size building structure on same site. It is tough, and we recommend you work with your CPD person to make sure that it is you are following all the rules, because these are very deal specific issues that we have to address when we're doing reconstruction. All right.
Stan, can I just quickly say that I want to make sure I didn't misspeak. It has to rebuild to the same size, because that was a question, but you can increase the number of rooms. So what I meant when I was discussing how you can rebuild something, what I meant is that you can increase the number of rooms in the structure, but it needs to be on the same site and the same size. And I posted that we will post that language from CPD Notice 0708 and for you guys to see in the Q&A. It'll be coming in a few minutes. So you can see where it actually says that in the notes. Thank you. Sorry, Stan.
So the only time as a developer I tried to do reconstruction was unsuccessful. And the reason was it was an old school, it was an old building that needed to be torn down, but we couldn't make the deal work with the same footprint. So financially, it wasn't going to be, we couldn't get enough units out of that same footprint in order to use CDBG for the cost. All right, we can go on to the next one. All right, poll time.
Oh, this is interesting. We've got a split in answers here. So
It's a horse race.
good question. Really good question.
All right, just let's do another minute or until we get to 70 respondents, because I think that's what we had last time. So if you have an answer, jump in.
I think we had over 80 last time. So they're still
Oh,
coming
yeah, that's
in.
I dropped off at 70. Okay.
Yeah, they're still coming in.
All right, very good.
Please feel free to answer the question. It's not attributed to anybody in any way. So this is a great way to just kind of learn about these programs. So feel free to answer the question.
Yep. Good point.
Okay, we're up to 75 answers
all right.
and it's slowing down. So
Okay, so upon completion, rehab buildings with CDBG fundings do not have to meet any minimum standards as part of the regulations. If you have decided part of your program and your policy and procedures is you've got to replace everything to code, and then you have to replace everything to code per your requirements, but CDBG does not require minimum grantee standards. Historic preservation is eligible. Rehab costs can be combined with acquisition cost, and I think that's it. So just that, remember with CDBG, you can do emergency repair. You can just fix a roof. As a former developer, I would say I liked it when we could do everything that needed to be done, but you don't have to with CDBG. In reality, there are budget constraints and other constraints that may make it not feasible for you to completely gut rehab a building, but you may be able to keep the roof from leaking. All right.
and so Stan,
Good
just
stuff.
related to that, somebody asked as a follow-up to the standards, are there minimum standards under CDBG DR or just under home? And you're doing the DR presentation later if you want to address that, but home has very specific housing condition and property standards, very specific ones. And so that is one guide that you can use. And do you want to talk about DR, Stan?
And DR, there are certain, you have to go back to the Federal Register notice. And at the very least, you've got to make sure that if something's in a floodplain, you are able to get it above base flood elevation if you're going to do more than 50% of the cost of repairs. But further that, it's going to be based on the language and the individual DR notices. And in all cases, DR always falls back to CDBG if it's not addressed in the notice.
And I have a DR expert on my panel with me.
All right, next slide. I think we're ready to move on. Beautiful. Okay, so multifamily rental activities. The project ownership can be public or private, so it can be owned by a for-profit developer. Mixed use buildings are allowed. We can pay for both commercial and residential, remembering we need to meet a national objective. Mixed income units are also possible. Remember with CDBG, if you have 3 or more rental units, 51% have to be reserved for folks that are low mod income to meet the low mod clientele, low mod housing national objective. Okay, so 51%. What that means is 49% don't have to be reserved for low mod income. So if you have 100 units, 51 at least need to be reserved. 49 could be market rate or a little bit higher rent. Special needs projects are allowed, but remember, facilities for persons with special needs and also facilities such as non-congregate shelter for housing, which we're seeing with CDBG-CV a lot these days, that those are public facilities, which means they're not subject to the new construction ban. They do need to be owned by a public agency or a nonprofit public facilities, but we can build new, use CDBG-CV, for instance, to build non-congregate shelters for folks experiencing homelessness. Okay. Next slide, please. All right, so the on April 30th, 2021, guidance was issued as part of the PPR tieback, CDBG-CV PPR tieback quick guide, which I have found extremely useful for getting questions to. It's written in a great format with an issue on the side and then the description of how the tieback would be used, an activity, and how the tieback would be used. So rehab, reconstruction of privately owned multifamily rental housing, addressing living conditions associated with more severe coronavirus disease or poorer post-COVID outcomes. So getting rid of mold. And what do you have to do to get rid of mold? We got to mediate the mold. You also have to make sure that the source of the water that was contributing to the mold growth is taken care of. So you could fix a roof, get rid of lead-based paint, increase ventilation. You could put in a higher tech HVAC system that may have UVGI, which supposedly kills viruses, which are often used in hospitals, or at least put in higher quality filters like HEPA filters. Remembering that with rental housing, higher quality filters, the HEPA filters are more expensive than the ones for the traditional HVAC systems. And so that will increase the owner's operating expenses, but also very good for limiting respiratory illnesses that are spread through the air. Okay, moving on. Now it's back to Mr. Carlson.
Thank you, Stan. Really quickly, just going to quickly respond to one question. There is a cross-cutting session of basically CDBG this week, but the question was basically, do cross-cutting requirements apply to rehabilitation? And the answer is yes. Fair housing requirements apply, environmental review requirements apply, to CFR 200 requirements for financial management, and administrative requirements apply. So there are the cross-cutting requirements that normally apply to any CDBG-CV activity also apply to CDBG for rehabilitation.
And then
okay, let's talk. Go ahead. Sorry.
Can we? I was just going to say we should do. We have two questions on the rental side before we move on.
Sure.
Does the low income requirement count for just the time of initial rental or permanently low income?
It says that there's 10 units and 5 are low income at the time of granting money.
So you're not meeting 51%. So there are other rules. Doug, you help me out with this, but there are other rules that address if it's a portion of the units are affordable, then you are limited. You could only do, in this case, 5 out of 10 is not 51%. So you could only do 50% of the cost of construction. Is that right, Doug?
Yeah, that's correct. But again, it's a question of whether or not you're meeting the national objective for housing, for low mod housing, right? And at a minimum for multi-unit, it's 51%. It can be proportion depending upon the number of affordable units like Stan described, but it has to meet the 51% requirement. That's in the rehabilitation regulations at 2 CFR 570-202. So my suggestion would be to go in and kind of look at those more in-depth descriptions of how you do rehabilitation and how you meet a national objective. Actually, 208 has national objectives information, But the bottom line is you've got to meet the 51% national objective one way.
And for regular CDBG, that is an initial occupancy. Most
Yes.
folks doing this want a longer term commitment.
Right.
And often CDBG isn't enough money to make the deal work by itself. So you may have low income housing tax credits in there as well. And then you've got, depending on your state, anywhere from 30 to 55 years worth of affordability.
Yeah, typically for multifamily deals, you're dealing with affordability for other federal programs. So periods of affordability for the home program, periods of affordability for the tax credit program could apply to a multifamily project that also involves CDBG. There is no period of affordability for CDBG, but CDBG is typically only one of many forms of financing for a project of that type. So that's exactly right.
All right, you're up.
Okay, I think we're on track. I'm looking at my watch and I think we're doing okay. Let's try to stay with it, make sure we get this all in within 2 hours. So we're going to talk about, which goes fast if you're a presenter, folks. So let's talk about home purchases as eligible activities. This is actually done by quite a few grantees, and they do it in different ways. But there's a couple of different ways that you can approach a home purchase activity. One of them is to just provide some form of assistance to a home buyer. So that would typically be down payment assistance or other types of assistance. And then the other way that you can help with a home purchase activity is to provide some form of development assistance, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. Most grantees, it all depends, but most grantees typically are financing some form of assistance to a home buyer to find a unit on the private market, but that does not mean that they aren't involved in homeowner development in one way or another. And again, we'll talk about that in a little while. And there's certainly models out there like land trusts, Habitat for Humanity projects, and other things that these often apply to. So we'll get into these in a little bit more detail here. So anything that is an assistance directly to a home buyer, and one thing to really remember, direct home ownership assistance means you're assisting that one household, and they have to be low and moderate income. So you can't aggregate, you can't do anything that when you're doing this type of assistance. You have to provide the direct assistance to a low and moderate income household if you're doing home ownership assistance, because it's one unit, one household. You can also fund assistance to home buyers as a public service activity. That isn't typically done for home ownership assistance. It's often done for counseling, which we'll talk about in a second, and some other things related to home ownership, but it's not always done necessarily for direct assistance to a home buyer because there are some caveats around that, not the least of which that it's subject to the cap on public services of 15%. So again, there's a couple ways you can do home ownership assistance, but usually it's direct assistance to a home buyer through some kind of program like down payment assistance, et cetera, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So next slide, please. I think Stefan's advancing for us. Thank you, Stefan. So let's talk about what we do if we're directly assisting a homeowner. So one of the most popular ways to assist a homeowner is to provide them with down payment assistance. Probably one of the hardest things for homeowners to come up with, particularly people who are lower and moderate income, and especially in certain markets in this country, which we know are all really exploding in terms of housing costs. But one of the ways to do that is to provide down payment assistance. CDBG limits the amount of down payment assistance that you can provide to 50% of what's required by the lender, right, for that particular housing unit. So you cannot provide all of the down payment assistance, but you can provide up to half of the down payment assistance. But in conjunction with down payment assistance, you can also pay for reasonable closing costs. You can help to write down the principal amount of a mortgage. So for example, if it's a $200,000 mortgage, you can have that written down with some form of assistance to a $150,000 mortgage. And then you can also help with acquisition financing for buyers to actually buy the housing. That would come through some form of lending program, which again would require policies and procedures It may, and oftentimes there is some collaboration with the bank when these types of programs are done, and financing is assistance with financing is provided. And then there are other things that you can do. You can provide mortgage guarantees and other types of, and interest reductions and other types of things that can directly assist a home buyer. But the most used one, because it's the most straightforward, is down payment assistance. Although there are other types of programs that grantees manage across the country. So if you're doing homeownership assistance as a public service, Stan, did you have a comment? I'm sorry, I saw your mic.
No, go ahead.
Okay, just making sure. Okay.
Thanks.
So if you're doing a public service form of down payment assistance, or if you're doing a public service for home ownership assistance, all you can do is down payment assistance. That's the only thing that's eligible if you're providing a direct assistance to a home buyer. So you can do other things as a public service, but if you're actually subsidizing the home buyer in some way, you have to do only down payment assistance. Housing counseling is another eligible activity. It's not the same as providing direct assistance to a home buyer. So all you can do is DPA if you're doing it as a public service. The other thing that was much more popular in the early 2000s, maybe not so much now, are helping with individual development accounts, especially individual development accounts that are used by folks towards the purchase of a home. So IDAs, you can deposit funds in an IDA if the family is eligible and meets the criteria. And they can use those savings that are in the IDA at some point in time to help purchase a home. Now, IDAs can be used for educational expenses as well, but in the case of housing, you can dedicate a savings account that can be used for a down payment or the acquisition of a property through an individual development account. So next slide, please. Okay, we're back to poll question number 3, I believe this is. So I got to get my Slido up. 1 second. That's what happens when your phone times out. Excuse me. CDBG funded home purchase assistance may include 50% of the required down payment, as well as additional assistance for the principal write down. That is a true or a false question. So can you do more than down payment assistance is the question. Can you also write down the principal? Can you do an interest rate reduction? Can you do other types of things beyond down payment assistance if you're doing home ownership assistance? It's kind of fun to watch these polls go up and down, I have to say. It's great. It is like a horse race, isn't it? Like it's like, you know, back and forth. Okay, so we're up to only about 40 responses, and we typically get over 70. So we'll let people give them just a little bit more time to answer. There could be a slight delay too. The chat questions coming in. Great. I'm glad to see we're getting as many answers on all these polls as we've gotten at the very beginning. I'm hoping that means that people are really interested in this session and are actively trying to be engaged in the Q&A and the polls, because this is a deep topic, frankly. And so learning some of the ins and outs of how you do, especially if you're new to CDBG, learning some of the ins and outs of how you do it for housing assistance is takes a while to navigate, frankly. And so this is a good starting point to use the Basically CDBG guide in this training as a way to kind of understand how you use it for housing assistance.
All right, we're at 74.
Okay, so what did you put, Stan? Let's put a presenter on the spot here.
I said it was true, and
Great.
in writing the question, I probably should have added an introductory phrase of "when not a public service," because
Exactly.
as Doug noted, that if it's a public service, only down payment assistance. But where people do sometimes often get tripped up, in my experience, is not understanding that if they're doing it not as a public service, but direct home ownership assistance, you can only do 50% of the down payment. So if it's a FHA loan, $100,000, so I can do math in my head in front of you all, then $3,000 is the required down payment.
Mhm.
The applicant would have to come up with $1,500.
Right.
But if they needed more, if they could only afford a $75,000 mortgage, you could then make up the difference between the amount of mortgage they can qualify for plus their down payment subtracted from the cost of the house. So you could do $1,500 for the down payment and another $25,000 toward the cost of the house. That would be allowable. You could also pay the closing cost as well.
Yeah, and actually Stan makes a really good point about different types of financing, potentially having different types of down payment requirements. So FHA being the standard at which the lowest down payment is required for an eligible home buyer, which basically meets the same criteria as CDBG. But there are other lenders that will require 10% or maybe even 20%, depending upon the loan, and they may require insurance as part of that as well. So again, there's lots of different ways. You can also help assist with the mortgage insurance as well. So there's lots of different ways to get people into housing, and the cost of it can vary greatly depending upon the source of the financing, unless you're directly assisting in some way with financing. So I love that poll question, actually. And yes, again, if it is a public service, you are limited to down payment assistance only. So
And limited to 15% public
And
services cap,
limited
which is,
for-
as
yeah,
Doug mentioned, why most people don't do it that way.
right. And that is just for regular CDBG, of course. So
Right, yes.
yeah, but we'll talk a little bit more about CV in some more slides later. So we have, well, I don't know if we have Q&As, but let's go to the next slide, please, and see if we have anything that we need to be addressing before we go into this next phase.
We can do it at the end of this slide.
Okay. So let's talk about how we do home purchases, right, as an eligible activity with CDBG. So this is remember, there were two ways that you can do home ownership assistance. One is to directly assist the family or the household that's low and moderate income. That's the homeowner assistance or the direct assistance approach. The other way that you can do homeowner assistance with CDBG is to do development assistance. So that's not necessarily to the homeowner. In fact, it's not. It's actually assisting usually the site in one way or another. And you have to remember that, and it's in CPD notice 0708, and we'll get into it in a minute, but there's a lot of very specific criteria around how you do this. Particularly if it involves a new construction activity, which we'll get into in a minute, which Stan will talk about. So what can you do when you're doing development assistance for home ownership? For an existing unit, you can do acquisition of the unit and rehabilitation of the unit. Remember, that's for existing housing. So that's one way that you can do development assistance for home purchases. But then you can also do, and again, this is in the notice in a lot more detail, but you can do things that help create homeowner units. And I mentioned Habitat and I mentioned Land Trust, but there are other models as well. There are neighborhood-based organizations, there are CBDOs, there are other types of organizations that do affordable housing development in one way or another, and you can use CDBG to assist with those types of development activities. So if it is a nonprofit or a public developer, you can help acquire the site or sites that are used for home purchase or home ownership. You can also do the public infrastructure that supports the housing. So that would be in the public right of way, different types of public facilities, activities that support the housing, water, sewer, sidewalks, etc. But again, this is not in the private part of the development, but in the public part of the development. Another way that you can assist with development is you can clear and demolish units in order to rebuild. So remember that clearance and demolition is typically done, and there are property standards or other, not property standards, but other types of code standards that apply probably locally. But obviously, if you're going to clear and demolish a unit, it's usually because it prevents or presents some type of hazard to the community in one way or another. And the best thing to do is to clear that site and demolish that site. But that's an eligible CDBG activity. Remember, if you clear and demo a site, you need to replace it with something. And it has to be something eligible. So, and if it's housing, then it has to be an eligible housing unit under block grant. So next slide.
So if we got a
Wanna
couple,
go
I
to
think
the
the next
questions
one is
before we do that?
yes. So, one question, could you use down payment assistance that's not a public service to avoid the cap? Yes,
Yes, you can.
absolutely, and should, I would
And
suggest.
most grantees do. Yep.
Right. And then someone asked if we could walk through the example again. I'm confused as to what down payment for FHA you would be looking at when also writing down the principal. So let's walk through. Let's see if I can do this verbally. I apologize for not being able to stop and do it on a whiteboard, but that's the world we're in now. So $100,000 house cost, and let's say we have an applicant that can afford a $70,000 mortgage. Okay, so they've got a $30,000 gap. With CDBG, if it's an FHA loan, FHA is going to require a 3% down payment. Okay, so that means that $3,000 is the required down payment. Our applicant has to come up with at least $1,500, half the down payment. We then would be able to provide the other half of the down payment with CDBG, so that's another $1,500. And then our applicant can only afford a $70,000 loan. So there now is a $97,000 amount of mortgage we need. Our applicant is going to be able to qualify for $70,000. So we would then be able to put in another $27,000 toward principal write down. And you'll have to let me know if that made sense. So we now have because after we take out the down payment required, we now have a $97,000 of mortgage they need, and they can only qualify for 70. So we would be able to provide a principal write down for the rest to get them to an amount where they could afford the house. Provided our policy and procedures allowed us to go up to $28,500.
Right. So the total amount of assistance, because I just did the math, thank you for confirming, 28,500. That's the principal write down plus the down payment assistance.
Okay. All right. Thought there was another one, but I'm not seeing it.
There's a question about section 3. So,
Okay.
The quick answer to the question is, does that interact with CDBG funds as it does with CDBG? And the answer is yes. Section 3 applies to CDBG-CV just as it does with CDBG. That's in the CPD notice for CDBG. It talks about the fact that all, except for what's allowed under the waivers and flexibilities in that notice, and it's Federal Register Notice 6218 N01. I have it memorized because I've looked at it a gazillion times. If the waivers and flexibilities are not allowed in the notice, then all other applicable CDBG requirements apply to CDBG-CV as well. So if it isn't waived or there isn't a flexibility, it's the same as CDBG, is the quick answer to that.
And the last home purchase eligible activity question we have is on the example I just gave. So the amount from the CDBG program is usually secured as a deferred payment second subordinate mortgage. So it's usually, the first mortgage lender won't let you be in first. So you're going to be in a subordinate position. So usually it's in second position, and it's usually deferred payment. So the folks are not making direct payments making payments to the second mortgage.
Right.
And to be honest, if you had them make payments to the second mortgage, that would increase the amount of debt they have, which would reduce the amount of their first mortgage. So it's usually not a good idea to provide people with a direct pay loan for purchase assistance.
Right. Good point.
Okay.
Okay.
I
Next
think we're ready to move on.
And I will, when I get a quick break, and I think I'm actually get my break right now, I will post the notice link, or we will have the notice link for CDBG-CV in Brand Live soon. I'll send it to you.
Okay. All right. So I got the easy slide. You can't use CDBG for constructing housing, except housing as last resort, which is described in the Uniform Relocation Act, is an exception for community-based development organizations. If something meets the criteria of a community-based development organization and is in a neighborhood revitalization area, then they can do new construction. Remember, public facilities such as a homeless shelter is not considered housing. It's considered a public facility, which means you can do new construction for non-residential, for non-housing. And by definition in the CDBG regs, a special needs facility is not considered housing. So that ban doesn't require. You can also do stuff to support new construction. So acquisition and disposition, you can buy property and hand it to a developer, donate it to a developer, pay, sell it to a developer, and have them do the development there. You can do site clearance and assemblage. Sometimes if you are in a neighborhood with a lot of absentee landlords, and you kind of want to redevelop a whole street, sometimes it takes public sector involvement to be able to assemble all the properties together, and site improvements on the site as well. It's also eligible. So basically what the regs say is you can't do new construction, except sometimes you can. And the sometimes you can is when you meet these exception requirements. Okay, next. With CDBG-CV, I'll be honest, it's eligible. I think it's tough. I think it's tough to be able to document that you are building new housing because units were overcrowded and how you're moving people from the other housing that was overcrowded into this new housing. I think it's hard. I think it would be hard to document. But again, if you're doing a public facility, which is not considered housing for this purpose. So if you're doing a non-congregate housing shelter, like buying a roadside motel, rehabbing it and converting it to non-congregate shelter, that is not residential by CDBG's definition. It's not housing. It is a public facility. So you can do new construction of those. And also rehab, of course, of those, which has become very popular. Okay. Next. I think, Doug, is it back to you?
Yeah, it's back to me. Thank you, Mr.
All right.
Fitterman. Remember that CBDOs, if you use them, have very strict criteria in terms of what constitutes a CBDO, and CBDOs have to be approved by your field office in order to use that, to use CBDOs to do new housing construction as part of an NRSA. So that is a fairly complicated, as Stan already said, that is fairly complicated for CV. Probably other low-hanging fruit for that program resource, to be honest with you, other than new housing construction. And the link to the notice, you may all have it, but if you don't, the link to the notice for CDBG-CV will be coming soon. So what that is posted on the HUD Exchange. So that notice outlines all the waivers and flexibilities for CDBG-CV, and also tells you what you can't do, like ignore Section 3, for example. So let's talk about housing services here for a second. So housing services can include information and referral. They can also include direct types of services to people who qualify, and we'll talk about that a little more in a second. But housing services and housing counseling, however you want to call it, can be done in a couple of different ways. So housing services or housing counseling can be part of a public service activity, and public service activities, I think you all know by now, are subject to the cap. It can also be part of another CDBG activity. In other words, if you're requiring housing counseling for new homeowners, right? If you're requiring that as part of the program, then that can be part of the program delivery for homeownership housing. So you can link that housing counseling requirement. So if people need lots of information about financial management, maintenance, other types of things related to being a homeowner, you can link that as a program delivery expense to your housing homeownership activity. You can also, although this is rarely used, you can use housing services and link it to home program activities. So all the home program standards apply, include home income rent limits, income and rent limits, but you can do the counseling for a home program of some kind or another, and you can do that as part of a CDBG assistance to the home program, but that's also rarely used. So if you're doing housing counseling or housing services as a public service, you have to do it. You can do it under area benefit, or you can do it under limited clientele, or of the national objectives. So you have a couple of different options for public services. If you're doing it as part of a CDBG or home activity, remember you're potentially assisting an individual family. So you have to meet the Lomont Housing National Objective. The Lomont Housing National Objective in this particular scenario is the only national objective that you can use for this form of housing services. So keep that in mind. It all depends on how you're applying it. If it's a public service, however, remember it's still subject to the cap. If you're doing it as part of a housing activity, then you have to make sure that it is a Lomont Housing National Objective. It cannot be area benefit, for example. It has to be the Housing National Objective. So next slide, please. So other real property activities. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, and I mentioned it earlier, but if you're acquiring a property, you still have to make a national objective in some way. So the end use matters if you're doing property acquisition. So you have to make sure that you know that when you're doing an acquisition of property that you have a plan for that property in the end, because you will not be able to close denitus until you actually enter beneficiary information and the unit is actually occupied, right? It has some type of certificate of occupancy if you're doing an acquisition project. So just acquiring the property doesn't get you all the way through as a housing activity to meet a national objective. You've got to have an end use, and it has to have beneficiaries that qualify under CDBG. So with respect to CDBG-CV, if you are using CV to address overcrowding in some way, and you're trying to mitigate the spread of coronavirus, or to deal with poor health outcomes because of coronavirus for people who are, again, are elderly, immune compromised, there's many different scenarios. You can use your CDBG-CV funds to mitigate the spread by reducing overcrowding, right? And Stan gave you some examples of how you can do that, right? You're taking people out of a congregate setting and putting them in a non-congregate setting. There's lots of different examples of how you can reduce overcrowding and try to get people into safe and hopefully healthy and safe housing in some form or another to help mitigate the spread of coronavirus. That's an eligible use of CDBG-CV. So CDBG-CV obviously can be used for housing, and there's lots of different scenarios that are available for how you do that. If you're doing the disposition of a property, you have to remember that you can pay for transfer costs, legal documents, other types of documents, and you can also do maintenance and other types of marketing efforts when you're selling a property that's assisted with CDBG. Disposition of a property is, again, not used very often. So that's typically not one of the major uses of it, but you can pay for a lot of the costs involved in disposing of the property if you're using CDBG-CV funds. And is there another bullet down there, Stan? I'm so sorry, I can't. Let me go. Sorry, I'm not in full screen. Let me go. 1 second.
Did you cover the clearances site cleanup or demolition?
Right. So when you're doing clearance,
that's the last one.
I see it. Thank you very much. It's my fault because I didn't have the screen size I needed. If you're doing clearance, you have to do site cleanup or demolition. That's what basically clearance means. It's basically what that says. So you're basically cleaning up a site that might be vacant in some way, and you're ready for housing in one way, or you're demolishing a structure that doesn't meet certain code or standards, and you're clearing that site in order to do a housing activity. So that's what clearance means with respect to other real property activities. Next slide, please. So tax foreclosed housing. So lots of communities, especially different periods over the last 30, 40 years, and block grant is that old now. There are still communities that have housing that is foreclosed for non-payment of taxes. That's also called in-reb housing. So you can cover eligible activities for those acquisitions, right? So that you have through tax foreclosure. You can do repair of the units. You can do expenses to maintain the habitability of the unit. And basically what you're doing is, and this happens in some areas where you have a lot of foreclosures, either because of an economic crisis or some other issue, you're really trying to prevent abandonment of units or deterioration of units in areas where there's a high number of foreclosures. This happened after the last housing crisis, and one of the reasons why we had the neighborhood stabilization program come online, actually, because we dealt with these types of situations where people could not afford mortgages anymore and they were in a state of foreclosure in the private market. But then this also can be used for tax foreclosures that are done for people who are not paying, for example, their property tax. So this is the area benefit usually that's used for in-rem housing or tax foreclosed housing. In some cases, you might be using it for slum and blight, but typically you're using this as low-mod area benefit. And it's usually for a number of units in a neighborhood, not necessarily just one unit, but it could be done on a unit-by-unit basis as well. So let's go to the next slide. Code enforcement. Code enforcement is used fairly regularly by CDBG grantees. When I worked at HUD, I had a number of grantees that used CDBG for code enforcement. So you can do code enforcement if you're doing it in a deteriorated or deteriorating area. You can accompany it by using other public or private improvements or services when you're doing code enforcement. So code enforcement is essentially one leg of a multi-leg strategy, right? So it's typically, code enforcement is used as a way to rehabilitate and revitalize an area that is deteriorated or deteriorating. It's typically combined with other types of activities that are available to that area, whether it be homeowner rehabilitation assistance or other forms of assistance to help people bring the properties up to code. So it's typically combined as more than one type of activity. Code enforcement identifies what's happening with the property, and then there's typically a back-end type form of assistance that comes with it. It helps low moderate income people bring their properties up to standards, up to code standards. So if you're using CDBG for code enforcement, you can use it for inspection, including the costs of the inspectors. And yes, those can be city inspectors. They don't have to be independent third-party inspectors. And then you can also use it for any enforcement expenses that are related to it. And that would include legal costs or other types of things that happen when you're doing code enforcement. So you have to make sure that you have to do a form of inspection that corrects violations, right? So you want to make sure that you're combining rehab with code enforcement, right? So you want to make sure that code enforcement is, and it is in IDIS as its own eligible activity. And then you have to, if you're doing rehab or revitalization of the unit in some way, that's a rehab activity. So correcting a violation isn't something you put in the code enforcement activity. Code enforcement is literally the two eligible costs that are identified above in the second bullet, main bullet, but when you're combining it with some form of assistance to a household, that's eligible as rehab. So they're separate activities is the point in that bullet. So next slide, please. So I'm going to take a drink really quick. So typically, if you're doing code enforcement, you're doing low and moderate income area benefit. So area benefit means that the area that you define has to be at least 51% occupied by low and moderate income persons. And there's lots of ways to get that information. You can use census data or surveys. Remember that when you do area benefit, because this is a point of confusion sometimes, it doesn't mean that you just say it's located in this area. You actually have to define a service area under area benefit. Simply having it located in a low mod area isn't typically going to help you meet the low mod area benefit criteria. You have to define that area for the program, and then you have to use the data to support that it's eligible as 51% or more low mod. So that's an important thing to remember when you're doing something like code enforcement. Also, and this was in the prior slide, remember it has to be deteriorated or deteriorating when you're doing code enforcement. So that is typically under state or local law. And under state law, it's typically urban renewal law. So old urban renewal laws usually define what a deteriorated or deteriorating area is. Usually it's 25% or more of the housing units or the major services in the area are dilapidated, but it varies by state and it can vary by local law definition as well. But you have to have it in accordance with some definition of what a deteriorated or deteriorating area is. And then there's some additional standards at 57208 under national objectives in terms of how you consider an area to be deteriorating. The same thing kind of applies, frankly, for slum blight area basis. You have to meet the qualifying requirements, which is the state or local definition of slum and blight, which again is typically in the codes for urban renewal. So it has to meet the qualifying requirements, and it has to, your activities have to meet the conditions that are identified as slum and blight. So for example, we used to call that an inventory of existing conditions. So what that basically says is that if you have a slum and blight area, you basically do a survey of the area and you identify the housing and other conditions that are deteriorating, and you use your block grant funds to address those deteriorating conditions. So you're going literally after the public improvements or the housing needs in that area as part of your slum and blight objectives. And so there are ways to do that, but it's usually done by an inventory of the existing conditions and then programs that address those conditions as part of their block grant delivery. So next slide, please.
All right, before we do, I think the next one's lead-based paint. Before we do that, we have a couple of questions we should probably get to.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, so while we're waiting for the slide to move. So permanent supportive housing would be considered housing and not a public facility, correct? Correct. But permanent supportive housing comes with leases. And usually they're at least 12 months. People have rights to tenancy. So by definition, permanent supportive housing would be a residential, a housing use, and would not be considered a public facility. Okay. If a city received a separate grant, non-HUD source to demolish low-income housing in a floodplain, can CDBG be used to locate, construct a new low-income housing unit at another location outside the floodplain? If you are using CDBG-DR, and if the notice is says that you can do new construction, then you would be able to do that with CDBG disaster recovery only. Remember, with CDBG, we can't do new construction of rental housing except in very limited circumstances with a CBDO, community-based development. I always make sure I have to say it out loud, make sure I got the letters in the right order. But a CBDO has to be involved, has to be in the neighborhood reinvestment area. As Doug mentioned, you have to have approval of your whole field office. So under regular CDBG, not DR, you can't do new construction of rental housing except in limited circumstances.
Right. And it doesn't matter if you're demolishing with other funds. It doesn't really exclude the fact that if you're using CDBG, it has to be for an eligible use and meet a national objective.
Right. Okay.
Just another quick question, Stan, that I'll just quickly answer. There will be at the during the last day, there will be a whole session on monitoring. We typically don't answer monitoring questions with respect to activities. That's something that you would want to coordinate with your field office staff. But there will be a session on monitoring as part of this session, as part of the CARES Act conference. So if you're curious about monitoring, I would definitely encourage you to attend that session.
And I'll quickly add, a lot of it depends on your policies and procedures as well. If you said something has to be affordable for 10 years, then you're kind of saying you have to prove it's affordable for 10 years. So you would have to do some monitoring to meet your own requirements. All right.
There's one more code enforcement question. Stan, maybe we'll get to it really quick since we're going into lead paint, if that's okay.
Okay.
Says, if a property owner asks for rehab assistance, property has code enforcement issues, and the household, and such as an illegal addition, and the household does not meet overcrowding conditions, can CDBG rehab funds be used to correct that legal addition? So again, remember, you have to be assisting a low and moderate income units. We're family households. We're just gonna assume that right from the very beginning. But again, if your code enforcement activity identifies the need for some form of rehabilitation assistance, right, in order to deal with the code enforcement issue. That's a separate activity. And as long as it's a separate rehabilitation activity that qualifies in its own right, you can address some of the code enforcement issues. That's kind of the point of doing code enforcement, that again, it's a multi-legged approach or multi-pronged approach, that you typically identify those issues and then you use resources under rehab or other resources to correct those deficiencies. So that would be basically, I hope that answers your question, but that would be the way that you would address that issue. So we're talking about lead-based paint activities, and we will talk about it with respect to CV too, actually. So when we use CDBG for lead-based paint activities, there's a number of things that you can do. You can evaluate a property for lead hazards, and in almost every case, if it is after 1970, let me get this right, Stan, 1975, is that right?
1978.
78, sorry.
78.
Okay, I should know that. I did know that, but I forgot it. So if it's pre-1978, then you should be doing a lead paint inspection, frankly. I mean, that should be part of your process. So if you're using block grant for lead-based paint activities, though, you can do inspection, you can do the testing of surfaces, and if you have an issue that needs to be dealt with, you can use it for remediation and abatement, and you can use it in some cases for relocation. So that's an eligible lead-based, those are all eligible as lead-based paint activity. You can do those as independent activities, even if you're not. So this is a little different than code enforcement, right? Where you can go, can and should combine it as part of a deteriorated area strategy. Lead-based paint evaluation and reduction is its own independent activity. You don't necessarily have to have rehabilitation assistance provided in a building, but you do have to get to a certain standard when you're doing lead-based paint abatement or reduction in some way. So, but that is its own eligible independent activity. So next slide, please. Trying to be cognizant of the time as well. So this is, so Stan and I are both CDBG-CV Q&A responders. So we have seen this question a number of times in the CDBG-CV Q&A, and it is a really important topic, so I'll try to spend a couple of minutes on it and hopefully make it clear to everybody who hasn't either seen that response or is thinking about this question for their activities. So remember, when it comes to lead-based paint for CDBG-CV, if you are doing some type of emergency assistance, and emergency assistance is defined in 570-207-B4 of the block grant regulations, and it basically is under the ineligible category of activities. But if you're using CDBG-CV, you can make emergency payments to assist people with their rent or mortgage payments for up to 6 consecutive months under CV. Under regular CDBG, it's only 3 months. But under CDBG-CV, it's up to 6 consecutive months. And that is actually in the notice that is posted for you if you don't have a copy of the notice. So this is one of the activities that's being used a lot with CDBG-CV. So you can go up to 6 months when you're doing emergency rent or mortgage payments. What you do have to remember with respect to lead paint is that even though you can go up to 6 months now versus 3 months with CDBG, if you exceed 100 days, then the lead-based paint requirements are triggered, they kick in. So you have to be able to make sure that you meet the lead-based paint requirements if you're exceeding 100 days after the initial payment of assistance. So that comes up a lot in the CDBG-CV AAQ. One of the response questions is typically, well, what if we limit it to less than 100 days, even with CDBG-CV? And the answer is, then the lead-based paint requirements are not triggered. It's when you're doing that assistance for more than 100 days that you have to do CDBG lead-based paint abatement, or you have to do lead-based paint abatement in accordance with the rule that's noted there and the requirements of the subpart related to that rule. So you have to make sure that if you're going beyond 100 days, that is something that's incorporated as part of your program delivery.
And I'll just add that HUD to make sure we're clear, HUD did issue an FAQ where they stated that, as Doug noted, from the 100 days from the initial payment. So if you paid 8 months worth of arrears for someone on day 1, that doesn't trigger, you paid 4 months at 120 days. That does not trigger, that's the clock hasn't started. The clock starts when you make that initial payment going forward.
Right.
If that makes sense.
And I'll try to find it and see if I can post it, but there is kind of an FAQ response related to kind of emergency payments for rent and mortgage assistance. That can be very helpful if you haven't seen it. So I'll try to find that when I'm done with my part, and we'll go post it for you. Okay, next slide, please. Historic preservation, that's Stan.
All right, historic preservation, and I'll say again, it's time consuming and hard, and it can be much more expensive. Often in doing historic preservation, windows are a trigger point for the architectural review boards. So instead of being able to buy, aluminum frame windows for, well, they used to be $500 or $600. I'm sure they've gone up since then. You have to have custom built wood windows that may cost you $3,000 or $5,000. So hard to do. It also takes time because you have to get SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office approval. But look, when I was a developer for a nonprofit, we didn't do historic buildings because we didn't have to. So we were working basically on a wide, half of a state was our target market. So we would avoid them. But if you're a city or a county and you've got an old historic building downtown that's been vacant, abandoned, and you want to restore it, you may not have a choice but to, that's, you can't decide you're not going to do it. So something that's listed in the National Register of Historic Places, listed in a state or local inventory, or designated as state or local landmark, those activities would all be eligible, providing we're meeting a national objective. All right. And next. All right, so one of my favorite things. So the renovation of closed buildings with CDBG. You also hear this referred to as adaptive reuse. So CDBG can be used to transform obsolete building into new uses such as housing or public facilities. And that was one of the questions that was asked earlier is, does it have to just be housing? No, you can do it for a public facilities. Happening a lot. Again, I've got experience working in California with their Project Home Key. They are acquiring old hotels, converting them into housing residential units. Some folks have used CDBG to convert schools, abandoned schools. I know someone that was working on an abandoned hospital as well. So it is taking something that exists. It's not new construction. So we are rehabbing it, reconstructing it, turning it into housing. So that may mean in a hotel, we are adding kitchenettes. It may mean that in a hotel, we are adding a kitchen per floor. If local zoning permits it, that's what's happening a lot in California. They're putting kind of congregate kitchens on each floor of a hotel when they do the rehab. The national, and let me pause for a second and put my developer hat on. They can be hard. There's often asbestos. There's often lead-based paint. The HVAC systems were not designed for residential use, so sometimes they need to be completely redone. You need to have, and the other thing that I think that's hard about them is, there are a lot of GCs that can build single-family housing. There's a lot of GCs with experience building multifamily housing, even doing rehab. There are fewer, we get a narrower market of folks that have experience converting an old warehouse into residential use or into commercial use. So that also can make them hard to do. You also need to either have a vision of being able to look at an old building and go, I know how this can look when it's done, or have an architect that's really good at that. They can look at it and say, yes, we can convert, based on what the mechanical engineer and the structural engineer are telling me, we can convert these into this number of units. Now, it has become popular in CDBG-CV because people are using old roadside motels to create non-congregate shelters for folks experiencing homelessness. So that also, because it's rehab and not considered new construction, you can also take an old hotel and convert it into perhaps fewer rooms, but combine a couple of them to make them into 1-bedroom apartments. And now you can have permanent supportive housing there as well. California is doing it. Seattle, Washington did it. And actually there was a study done by University of Washington that noted the folks who moved into the non-congregate shelter when they were doing hotels had less incidence of COVID, had access services more than people who did in congregate shelter, and were more willing to start thinking about permanent housing opportunities for them than folks that were in, that had just been in a congregate shelter. So it seems to work better for our target market, better for people who were experiencing homelessness, and was also a little bit of a safer environment. And let's face it, the market I'm in Florida, in Orlando, outside of Orlando and Kissimmee. It's roadside motels are primarily where folks are living who are experiencing homelessness, and they're paying upwards over $1,000 a month, equivalent of over $1,000 a month, $1,200 a month. So in that area, it's a lack of rental housing. That it's a basically suburban style zoning, single family housing. Developers recently have been focusing on the higher end of the market. So as a result, you've got a lack of, as many parts of the country have, a lack of affordable rental housing. These roadside motels became their affordable rental housing. You would also, it also is possible, this is outside our topic today, but folks have used the low mod jobs when they've done adaptive reuse as well. And I think that was one of the questions also is, does it have to be housing? And it doesn't have to be housing necessarily, can be a public facility. Also, again, outside of our topic, but it can be also used to create low mod jobs as well. Okay, next slide, please. So, all right, we just talked about that. And so use CDBG-CV to convert public and commercial buildings into housing, acquire it, and usually folks are doing it for either folks that are in congregate to get them out of non-congregate into non-congregate, and sometimes using it for rehab to do permanently supportive housing, where you may have folks that are moving from a congregate shelter that are ready to go to a permanent supportive housing, or in interim housing, non-congregate, and are ready to take on a lease. Okay, I think the next one is a poll.
Yep. So the question in the poll, another great question. CDBG can be used to transform obsolete buildings into new uses such as housing, public facilities, both housing and public facilities, or neither housing or public facilities. We still got good participation. That makes me happy. Some smart people out there. Okay, Stan, it looks like we got 71 answers, which is where we usually are. So,
All right. So both housing and public facilities are eligible. And as we talked about previously, you could outside our scope, but you could also do low mod jobs, turn it into, take an old building and turn it into something that's going to create jobs and meet the low mod job national objective. Not what Doug and I were hired to talk to you about today, but that just wanted to make sure that that's everyone aware that that's also possible. But housing and public facilities, absolutely possible. Okay, then we had a couple of questions. Well, one going back to the home purchase that I missed, we both missed, is down payment assistance forgivable? Always. You can always forgive it. It doesn't even have to be recaptured, unlike the home program. But it can be forgiven immediately. Most people don't do that, but deferred payment loan that's forgiven after 5 or 10 years is common. Okay. Before pursuing an adaptive reuse project in an abandoned building, has the grantee document due diligence for a quick market study or long-term use and operations of the facility? Well, there are different ways. Memphis had acquired an old Sears warehouse. I don't know if anybody from Memphis is joining us, but I believe they knew what they wanted out of this. They wanted residential and commercial. They put out an RFQ for developers to come in and give them their ideas of how they would structure the deal. So in terms of other due diligence, yeah, you need to make sure that it's feasible to rehab it. So engineeringly, structurally engineering, it's feasible to do the conversion. You would want to take a look at the end use and make sure there's a target market for that. One example outside of CDBG is there are several markets around the country where LIHTC deals have been overbuilt. So there are lots of housing available for people earning between 50 and 60 a median, because that's where LIHTC, that's a sweet spot for LIHTC deals, but much fewer available options for people making 40% or lower than median. So some markets are overbuilt for the housing. So is there a demand for my end use? That's going to be. Will it cash flow? A lot of people dump that onto the developers who are proposing how they would restructure the deal, but you've got to be able to show if it's going to be housing, will rent cover my operating expenses? So that's going to be an important thing when you're evaluating an RFQ for something like this is, do they show that it has a positive cash flow? And if they're asking for operating expense money as well, capitalize an operating reserve, is that something we can afford to do with other sources? So
yeah, I would just add that, Stan is basically getting back, and the question of due diligence is such a good question, because remember, if you're a CDBG grantee, you're still ultimately responsible for the program delivery in one way or another. So the question of whether or not you're analyzing the potential market for a development project is a really important one. And I'm pretty sure, Stan, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're doing LIHTC, you have to have a market study anyways.
absolutely.
So as a best practice, for example, if you're doing a LIHTC funded project, you're going to have to do a market study anyways. But if you're not, the point here is simply that if you don't have a market for the units, or you can't determine if there's a market for the units, it's probably not a good idea to dive into this type of a project. It's really important. They do have to cash flow, and there does have to be a way to make the program work. So that is a due diligence in policies, procedures, due diligence. All those things are kind of applicable to, like, how are you going to run your program essentially, and what standards are you using? There is a quick question. I hope it went back to you folks in the posting back to you, but there was a question about whether lead-based paint applies to ESG-CV. So rather than get into that, since this is CDBG that we're talking about, I posted the last notice for ESG-CV for you to review if that's your question, and it is near the end of the notice. The answer is that it does apply, but go ahead and read the notice and make sure that you understand those requirements. It is in that notice that we had posted as a link. So, and then quickly, Stan, there were a couple of questions about IDAs. So that were a little bit earlier, and I don't think we got to all of them. Like, who controls the IDA? A bunch of other questions. there is, again, and I hate to do this, but I'm trying to provide resources to you as we're doing this presentation beyond what's in the presentation or in basically CDBG. There is a CPD notice on IDAs, how to use IDAs and how to use CDBG to support an IDA program, and that has been posted as well, or will be posted shortly into the links, as a link for you to access. So that notice will outline, you know, the requirements around using CDBG for IDAs, and it's certainly more detailed than what we can go through in a presentation, especially as we're starting to run out of time. But that resource is available to you if you want to access it and read it.
All right. And then finally, is there any restrictions on the use of CDBG funds in National Register areas or buildings? I'll start. Yeah, you've got to follow the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. You have to submit the plans to them. They have to review it and make sure the plans are consistent with the historical nature of the building. That could mean anything from making sure doors look like they were the original doors. It usually almost always means windows have to be done. If you're disturbing any earth, you've also doing any, you know, you're going to redo the parking lot or something, you're going to have to also, as part of the environmental review process, reach out to the tribes in your area to make sure that there's not going to be any problem digging up things there. So yes, there are you have to follow the cross-cutting regs and do everything that's required if you're going to rehab a historic building.
And there's a few great examples out there. I mean, I had a personal experience with a historic building in a downtown area being renovated and then actually being the new place for a startup business to locate. As one, it had other uses as well. It had a multi-use facility, but you know, there was actually a startup business that was in that building doing job creation as part of that renovation. So there's lots of different ways that you can do adaptive reuse for a historic building, but like Stan said, you have to meet the requirements when it comes to a building that's on the register or is considered historic in some way or another. So, but there's examples out there of how you can do that for sure. It does happen.
And HUD has a Main Street program. Again, not something we're supposed to talk about today, but the HUD Main Street program is targeted to small communities, and it's aimed at rehabbing downtown. As part of the Hope 6 program, it's aimed at rehabbing historic buildings in downtown areas and smaller communities. All right, I guess next slide. Are we doing on questions, Doug?
I think we're good on questions.
Okay.
So, and are we going to 15 after, or do I have to do this in 3 minutes? I should know that.
We have till 1:15.
Okay,
I'm sure
good.
no one will argue with you if you do it a little quicker.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure
you'll
they
feel
won't.
cheated.
But I talk fast anyway, so you know, I don't even know if I need to slow down. So I mentioned a part of the CDBG regulations, which is 24 CFR 570-207. So 570-207 lists what is ineligible under CDBG, and it has a number. You know, you know what these are if you're a grantee. Buildings for the general conduct of government, for example, is ineligible. But when it comes to housing, there are actually citations in 570-207 that talk about what's an ineligible housing activity. So by statute, by the actual statute for CDBG, new construction is prohibited unless it's under certain circumstances. So again, and that's carried out by a community-based development organization. So new construction is typically a no-no, and that is actually listed in that part of the regulations. Mortgage guarantees of one kind or another are not eligible as a housing activity. And we talked about this before as well, but you can do a lending type program, a tool lending program, but you can't purchase construction equipment and call it a housing activity. So that equipment has to come from whoever's developing your site. And again, we talked about this as the emergency payments, and they use the word emergency in this slide. And HUD uses the word emergency, I should say, because it is typically an ineligible activity unless it's considered an emergency of payment. So under CDBG, it's 3 consecutive months made to the service provider or the lender on behalf of the family. That's something that we should have pointed out earlier, but if you're using this form of assistance, you cannot provide it directly to the household. You have to provide it to the utility or to the mortgage company or whoever else is servicing a household for that family. You can't provide it directly to them. It is 3 months under CDBG, 6 months under CDBG-CV. And I also had a link posted to how you use CDBG-CV for arrears and emergency payments. There's an FAQ on that I also had posted in the link. So if you haven't seen that and you're considering this activity or managing this type of activity, there's some FAQ responses that may be helpful. Again, so these are not eligible payments, mortgage or utility payments, except again when they're provided as a loan, as part of a financing package, or when they're provided by CBDO as part of a CBDO project. So in general, this is a very rarely, if ever used, part of the block grant regulations. CDBG-CV brought it more to the forefront because people needed emergency rental and mortgage assistance payments. But this is, again, emergency payments are listed as ineligible, not in the eligible activities in 570-201. They're actually listed as ineligible. So this, again, this is a reminder that typically these types of things are not eligible. So next slide.
I think that's it.
We're it? Okay, so we're back to
You
the
did
meeting.
it.
Thank you.
Or did you? Or was that it? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And I'll
Yeah,
add
that's the
just,
last slide.
all right. I'll add just for conversation purposes, Doug, before CV, I didn't know anybody that was doing assistance of payments. Did you?
No.
No. So this
No.
is brand new for all of us on this.
Yeah, I mean, in the case if there wasn't DR funding, there was interim assistance or emergency assistance that was provided to respond to a disaster, but that's not the same as providing some kind of subsidy to help a family, right? It's completely different.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other forms of emergency assistance that is provided with CDBG, but it's typically event related, and it's very, very rarely. In fact, I can't think of an instance beyond CV where there was this type of assistance that was provided directly to a household. It's very rarely used. And again, it's ineligible in the regulations technically, but there are some exceptions.
All right. I think we've covered all the questions. Unless anyone wants to jump in quickly with the last one. But Doug, any parting words?
Other than thank you, no. Thank you, Mr. Fitterman, as usual. Always great to work with you. And I hope that you found this to be useful. And this is a category of use for CDBG that's often used for different types of activities, whether it's multifamily or single family rehab or home ownership. So hopefully the resources that we provided to you and the information in this presentation was helpful. And we hope you have a good rest of your conference. I am on again tomorrow for a couple of sessions. I don't know about you, Stan, but I'll be doing 2 more tomorrow.
I've got 2 on Friday, duplication of benefits, and I'm sure one to be very well attended, 4 o'clock on a Friday, CDBG versus CV versus DR. So.
Well, there's definitely going to be DR grantees that are going to be attending that. There's no doubt about that. Okay, that's it for me. Stan, unless you have anything else.
All right, no, thank you everybody for coming. It's been a pleasure spending the last 2 hours with you.